Let us talk about what those numbers actually look like when you put them in context. In November 2025, Linux gaming hit something of a watershed moment. The Steam hardware survey recorded Linux at 3.2% of the total user base. That might not sound like much at first glance, but here's why it matters. It was the highest market share Linux had ever achieved on the platform, and it represented a staggering 57% increase compared to November 2024, when Linux sat at just 2.03%. To put real faces behind those percentages, we are talking about roughly 4.22 million monthly active gamers choosing Linux out of Steam's approximately 132 million users. That's millions of people who decided that gaming on Linux was not just possible, but preferable for their setup. The momentum did not stop there, either. By March 2026, the numbers climbed even higher. Linux reached 5.33% market share, translating to an estimated 7 million monthly active Linux users on Steam. We are looking at a platform that essentially tripled its foothold in just over a year. What makes these figures particularly striking is how they contradict the old assumption that Linux gaming would always remain a rounding error. For years, Linux hovered around that 1% threshold, seemingly stuck. Then something shifted, the trajectory changed, and suddenly we are watching a genuine breakout rather than a niche curiosity. These are the hard numbers that tell us Linux gaming has moved from enthusiast experiment to mainstream consideration. The Steam Deck did something that years of advocacy never could. It made Linux gaming accessible to regular people who had never even heard of operating systems beyond Windows or maybe MacOS. Valve shipped approximately 3.7 million units through 2024, and by mid-2025, that number had climbed to an estimated 5.6 million devices. Those are not just hardware sales, they are gateway moments. Consider what it means that SteamOS Holo, the custom operating system powering the Steam Deck, now accounts for somewhere between 26 and 36% of all Linux gaming installations on Steam. That's a massive slice of the pie coming from a single device line. What this tells us is pretty straightforward. Most people discovering Linux gaming are not installing Ubuntu on a spare laptop. They are buying a handheld, turning it on, and realizing somewhere down the line that they are technically running Linux. It just happens to work. The device captured nearly half of the handheld PC market in 2020 for a 48% share. That puts it comfortably ahead of competitors trying to carve out their own space. And people are not just buying these things, they are using them. Steam Deck users logged 330 million hours of playtime in 2024 alone, representing a 64% jump from the previous year. That's not a novelty purchase, that's genuine engagement. The momentum carried right into 2025, with 870,000 new devices sold in the first quarter alone. Each one of those sales represents someone entering the Linux ecosystem, often without even realizing it at first. The Steam Deck became the on-ramp that Linux gaming had been waiting for, not through technical superiority or ideological arguments, but through sheer convenience and a good product. Sometimes that's all it takes. When you dig into the hardware choices of Linux gamers, something striking jumps out. Immediately, AMD processors dominate in a way that almost defies belief among Linux users on Steam. AMD C++ command a 73.6% market share. Compare that to Windows gamers, where AMD sits at just 38%, and you start to see how dramatically different these two ecosystems really are. This is not an accident. The Steam Deck runs on a custom AMD system on a chip, And that single fact has shaped an entire generation of Linux gaming hardware. When Valve designed the deck, they went all in on AMD, and millions of players followed. But there is more to the story than just the deck. Linux enthusiasts have long favored AMD for another reason entirely. The company committed to open source driver support years ago, and that decision won them a fiercely loyal following in the Linux community. While NVIDIA still struggles with its reputation among Linux users, AMD kept things simple and transparent. The numbers tell the rest of the story. In December 2020, AMD reached a record high of 38.7% overall share in Valve's survey, while Intel dropped to 63.4%. That is impressive on its own, but the gap between Linux and Windows users reveals where the real momentum lies. Intel still dominates the Windows side, but on Linux, AMD is the default choice. The contrast could not be starker. What we are seeing is not just a hardware preference, it is a philosophical divide. Linux gamers vote with their wallets, and they are voting for open source. For years, the biggest objection to Linux gaming was simple and devastating: you could not play your games. The library that Windows users took for granted simply did not exist on Linux. People would look at the platform, see the compatibility gap, and walk away. It was a deal breaker. Then Valve created Proton, and everything changed. Proton is a compatibility layer that sits between Windows games and the Linux operating system. When you launch a game designed for Windows, Proton intercepts the commands that game sends out and translates them into something Linux can understand. The game never knows it is not running on Windows. It just works. The numbers here are genuinely remarkable. Nearly 90% of Windows games now run on Linux through Proton. That is not a typo. We are talking about the vast majority of a massive game library suddenly becoming playable on an operating system that was once considered a wasteland for gaming. What makes this different from older compatibility solutions is the user experience. There is no complicated setup. You do not need to configure anything manually on the Steam Deck. Especially, you just install a game and hit play. The underlying technology handles the translation invisibly. Valve threw serious resources at this problem. They partnered with Codeweavers, the company behind Wine, and hired developers to work full-time on improving game compatibility. They built ProtonDB, a community-driven database where users report what works and what does not. This created a feedback loop that accelerated development. The impact on adoption cannot be overstated. Before Proton switching to Linux meant leaving behind your game library. Now, it means keeping almost all of it. That single change removed the primary barrier that kept gamers locked into Windows. When you look past Steam's holo, something fascinating emerges in the numbers. The Linux gaming world is not just about the Steam Deck anymore. Not by a long shot. Arch Linux sits in second place among Linux distributions on Steam, capturing nearly 10% of users. That makes sense when you think about it. Arch appeals to the kind of person who wants total control over their system. The same type of enthusiast who might build their own gaming PC rather than buy something pre-built. It is a do-it-yourself mindset that overlaps perfectly with the Linux gaming crowd. Right behind Arch, you find Linux Mint 22.2. Holding steady at about 7%. Mint has always been the friendly face of Linux, the distribution people recommend to newcomers. The fact that it shows up this prominently among gamers tells us something important. Not everyone is chasing bleeding-edge performance or custom kernels. Some people just want a stable desktop that plays their games without fuss. But here is where the story gets really interesting. Gaming-focused distributions are growing fast Kakios picked up almost 3/4 of a percentage point in November 2025 alone. Bazite grew even faster, jumping nearly 1.5% in that same month. These are not incremental gains in the world of operating system market share. That is explosive growth. What Bazite and Kakios represent is something new entirely. They are not general-purpose distributions that happen to play games. They are built specifically for gaming from the ground up. Bazite, in particular, targets the living room experience, aiming to bring that console feel to a full desktop environment. When you add everything up, desktop Linux distributions account for more than 70% of Linux gaming beyond SteamOS. That is a crucial distinction. The Steam Deck may have opened the door, but people are walking through it and setting up shop elsewhere. They are building gaming PCs with Arch. They are turning laptops into portable gaming machines with Bazite. The ecosystem is diversifying, and that diversity points toward a future where Linux gaming is not tied to any single device or distribution. So where does all of this actually go from here? If you project the current trajectory forward, some analysts are suggesting Linux could hit around 4% market share by mid-2026. That might not sound like much, but in the context of desktop operating systems, it would represent a significant shift. The growth has been consistent enough that such predictions do not seem entirely unrealistic. But there is something important to understand about these numbers. The Steam hardware survey is not a perfect instrument. It has quirks that can make the data a bit noisy at times. Take what happened in December 2024. The survey showed AMD processors at around 74% among Linux users and Intel at roughly 30%. If you are doing the math in your head, you have already spotted the problem. Those numbers add up to more than 100%, which is obviously impossible. Something in the methodology was double counting or misattributing certain configurations. Language data creates similar complications. That same December survey showed simplified Chinese usage dropping by over 3%, while English jumped by more than 9%. These kinds of swings do not reflect actual user behavior so much as they reflect who is responding to the survey in any given month. When the user base in China fluctuates, it can artificially depress or inflate Linux's measured share. Since different regions have different levels of Linux adoption, all of this needs to be viewed against the broader competitive picture. Windows still commands nearly 95% of the Steam user base. MacOS sits at around 2%. Even with Linux's recent gains, the gap remains enormous. The question is not whether Linux will overtake Windows anytime soon. It will not. The question is whether it can continue its steady climb from niche curiosity to a genuinely viable alternative for a meaningful slice of gamers. The path to 4% is visible. Getting beyond that will require more than just the Steam Deck carrying the torch.